There comes a moment in every human life, often not marked by great fanfare or dramatic upheaval, when the individual must confront the quietly terrifying realization that the difference between mastery and mediocrity, between sovereignty and servitude, is not found in external circumstances or inherited gifts, but rather in the quality of discipline that one is capable of summoning, maintaining, and embodying even in the silence of solitude and the storm of chaos. And it is precisely here that the shadow of Niccolò Machiavelli emerges, not as a cold, political strategist, as he is so often misrepresented, but as a fierce advocate for internal dominion, a warrior of the psyche who understood that discipline is not merely a habit or a behavior, but a structure of power, a mechanism of survival, and ultimately, a relentless art of living deliberately. To truly grasp what Machiavelli meant when he wrote about the architecture of power, one must first shed the illusion, a deeply ingrained, culturally romanticized belief, that discipline is the domain of morning routines, to-do lists, or motivational quotes. For in Machiavelli's world, and indeed in the harsh reality he sought to unveil, discipline was not a feel-good notion or an act of self-improvement. It was war, a continuous, strategic, often merciless campaign against the entropy of one's own nature. And to win this war, one must become not only the soldier but the general, not only the architect but the fortress itself. You see, Machiavelli was not interested in polishing virtue for the sake of public admiration or moral high ground. He was far more concerned with what worked, with what endured, and what granted a man the capacity to govern himself and others in a world governed by unpredictability, betrayal, and brute force. And it was in this crucible of harsh truth that he forged his core insight, that without discipline, without internal command, without the cold steel of mental strategy, even the most talented, noble, or visionary man would be crushed by the fine weight of his own instincts, undone not by his enemies, but by his failure to master his own impulses. To understand Machiavelli's model of discipline, one must begin with a rejection of the modern myth that self-control is a matter of occasional effort, of waking up inspired, or of believing in oneself, and instead confront the reality that discipline, for Machiavelli, was not a mood but a permanent stance, a state of constant readiness, a refusal to be dictated by circumstance, feeling, or the chaotic winds of fortune. For as he wrote in The Prince, fortune is a woman, and if you wish to keep her under, it is necessary to beat and ill-use her, which, stripped of its archaic metaphor, tells us this: luck favors the prepared, the bold, and above all, the disciplined, who are not seduced by comfort or frozen by fear. But what does it mean, practically and psychologically, to become disciplined in Machiavellian sense? It means that you must stop looking at discipline as a tool for isolated tasks and start seeing it as an operating system, a lens through which every decision, reaction, and intention is filtered and evaluated, not based on emotion or fatigue, but based on strategy and consequence. It means waking each day not with the question, "What do I feel like doing?" but rather, "What action brings me closer to internal control and external influence?" Because Machiavelli, above all, believed that power without control is merely illusion, and control without discipline is unsustainable chaos waiting to explode. When Machiavelli writes in the Discourses that the orders of a wise captain are not obeyed by undisciplined soldiers, he is not merely describing the structure of armies or the failure of mercenary forces. He is holding up a mirror to the internal condition of the individual, suggesting that unless your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are trained like loyal soldiers, your highest intentions will collapse under pressure, and you will find yourself retreating, sabotaging, and surrendering to the first moment of pain, doubt, or temptation. Most people believe they lack discipline because they lack motivation, but Machiavelli would argue that this belief is not only false, but fatal. Motivation is fleeting, emotional, and often unreliable. It arises when life is easy, when the path is lit, and disappears the moment discomfort or uncertainty appears. And for this reason, those who base their discipline on motivation are like generals who only march their armies on sunny days. They win nothing, because they do not fight when it counts. Discipline, for Machiavelli, was never optional. It was the fundamental architecture of resilience and power, a way of being that protected the individual from the seduction of fear, the betrayal of impulse, and the cruelty of chance. And this is perhaps his greatest insight, that in the absence of internal discipline, external forces will always conquer you. Because if you do not shape your habits will shape you. If you do not govern your mind, someone or something else will do it for you. Let us now take a brutal, honest look at the modern mind. Distracted by devices, flooded by dopamine, weakened by comfort, seduced by instant gratification, it is, as Machiavelli would say, a city without walls, a state vulnerable to every enemy within and without, not because it lacks intelligence or virtue, but because it lacks structure, order, and the martial spirit necessary to maintain integrity in the face of daily assault from temptation and fear. And this is the first truth we must accept if we are to master discipline, that without internal sovereignty, we are not free, but merely servants of whatever urge happens to shout the loudest. Machiavelli understood, with chilling clarity, that a prince who is not disciplined is more dangerous to himself than any external enemy, because he becomes a threat to his own survival, a saboteur of his own power. And this is no different for the modern man or woman. We each carry within us the seeds of our destruction. And unless those seeds are smothered by structure, by vigilance, and by continuous correction, they will bloom into the thorns of regret, failure, and wasted potential. But now we turn to the real challenge. How does one actually cultivate this Machiavellian discipline, this relentless inner structure that cannot be broken by fatigue, emotion, or circumstance? The answer begins not with action, but with vision. Not a vague dream or a motivational fantasy, but a strategic vision of who you must become. One that is defined not by desire, but by necessity. For discipline grows when the pain of being weak becomes greater than the pain of being strict. And so you must look at your current life with surgical honesty and identify where chaos rules, where you are ruled by impulse instead of strategy, where you retreat instead of advance, and mark those places as the battlefield on which your discipline will be forged. From this awareness, you must construct structure, not rigid schedules that collapse under stress, but flexible systems that adapt without breaking, daily rituals that are designed not for ease or excitement, but for endurance and execution. Because Machiavellian discipline does not celebrate doing what feels good. It demands doing what must be done, especially when it feels like the hardest choice in the world. Then, you must train your thoughts. The way a general trains an army, repeatedly, harshly, and without compromise, monitoring your inner speech, identifying the mental habits that erode strength, excuses, blame, distraction, and replacing them with commands that align with your purpose. Because a disciplined mind speaks to itself like a soldier receiving orders, clearly, firmly, and without negotiation. Over time, this internal transformation, painful, unglamorous, and invisible to most, begins to yield its greatest reward. A sense of control, not over the world, which remains chaotic, but over the self, which becomes immovable. And from this stillness, from this internal dominion, power emerges. Not the power to dominate others, but the rarest and most unshakable power of all, the power to govern oneself in the face of anything. Machiavelli's doctrine of discipline, then, is not a system of cruelty, but of clarity. It is not about punishment, but preparation. Not about moral superiority, but psychological sovereignty. And if you give yourself 25 minutes to reflect, to restructure, to realign your mind with the truth he tried to offer, you will begin to see discipline not as a burden but as your greatest weapon, your last line of defense. and your only path to becoming the ruler of your own fate. So do not waste this insight by returning to comfort. Build your dikes before the flood, train your soldiers before the battle, govern your mind before the storm. For Machiavelli knew what many still refuse to see, that without discipline, we are nothing but leaves in the wind, slaves to fortune, and prisoners of our own disorder. But with discipline, practiced ruthlessly and lived sincerely, we become something else entirely. We become strategists of the soul, masters of fate, builders of empires that no external enemy can take, because they are fortified from within. And this, Machiavelli would say, is the first and final rule of power: discipline first, victory after. Yet even as we begin to internalize this Machiavellian model of discipline, as not merely a behavioral trait, but as the very scaffolding upon which the architecture of personal sovereignty and psychological durability must be built, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that the greatest threat to our disciplined life is not, and has never been, the external world with all its distractions and unpredictability, but the quiet and persistent whispering of the inner saboteur, the part of ourselves that finds endless reasons to delay, to rationalize, to soften the edge of our determination in favor of convenience. And it is this internal adversary that Machiavelli would have urged us to confront with the same ruthless precision a commander must apply when rooting out traitors from within his own ranks. Because the truth, as Machiavelli knew all too well, is that internal weakness is never neutral. It is not a benign flaw to be tolerated or excused, but a systemic vulnerability that, if left unchecked, grows like a crack in a dam, invisible to the untrained. Until it suddenly bursts forth with catastrophic force, washing away years of progress, drowning the very foundations of character that were never truly fortified by daily discipline, but only dressed in the illusion of good intentions and occasional effort. And so, if you would master discipline, not as a phase or an experiment, but as a permanent posture of power, you must begin to treat your own mind as both the battleground and the sovereign territory to be defended at all costs. Meaning that every moment of indulgence, every surrender to laziness, every impulsive reaction that goes uncorrected must be seen not merely as a slip, but as an invasion, a breach, a trespass upon your inner empire, which once compromised, will no longer be governed by your will but by your whims. And in Machiavellian logic, this shift is nothing short of political suicide, what few are willing to accept. And what Machiavelli understood with a clarity as brutal as it was liberating, is that true discipline is forged not in moments of glory or grand decision, but in the dull repetitions of ordinary days, in the quiet hour before sunrise when no one watches, in the lonely battles fought when the comfort of retreat seduces the soul far more than the pain of persistence. And it is in those hours, in those decisions, that you reveal whether you are ruled by fortune or fortified by virtue. Indeed, when Machiavelli contrasted Virtù with Fortuna, he was not simply speaking of historical forces or political conditions, but articulating a profound truth about human nature, that those who live reactively, waiting for the right time or the perfect motivation, are enslaved to fortune, like sailors who build no sails yet curse the wind, while those who develop Virtù, that rare fusion of strength, skill, foresight, and mental resilience, are capable of navigating even the most hostile seas, not because the storms cease, but because they have become captains who command, rather than passengers who hope. And so we arrive at a turning point, a psychological fulcrum, if you will, where you must ask yourself not what your goals are, nor what your dreams whisper to you late at night, but rather whether you have built the internal capacity to sustain those goals in the crucible of real life, under pressure, amidst boredom, fatigue, and failure. Because dreams without discipline are mere hallucinations, and potential without structure is a slow, bitter tragedy unfolding in daily increments. Machiavelli, in his cold brilliance, would not have wasted time trying to inspire you with poetic ideals or sentimental encouragement. He would have shown you the battlefield of your life and pointed to the places where your walls are crumbling, where your defenses are weak, where your soldiers are undisciplined and your commanders asleep, and he would have told you with unwavering bluntness, fix this or fall. Because in the end, for Machiavelli, discipline is not a virtue to be admired, but a weapon to be wielded. Not a sign of goodness, but a shield against collapse. Not a performance, but a condition of survival. And survival, in his world and in ours, is not granted to the hopeful, the talented, or the kind, but to the prepared, the hardened, and the self-governed. If you understand this, not with fleeting intellectual interest, but with bone-deep conviction, then you begin to see that every time you obey your structured plan instead of your chaotic emotion, every time you act according to your strategy instead of your stress, every time you follow through when quitting would be easier, you are not merely being disciplined in the popular sense. You are affirming your place as sovereign over your own destiny, building the walls of your inner fortress stone by stone, and proving to fortune that you are not hers to toss about, but her equal, her rival, her master. And perhaps, if you live this way long enough, you will see what Machiavelli saw in his darkest yet most empowering revelation, that the disciplined man is not just someone who survives longer or performs better, but someone who, by virtue of his internal order, gains the rarest prize of all in this disordered world, the power to shape reality, to endure storms without breaking, to lose battles without losing the war, and to rise always again and again, with the fierce calm of one who no longer waits for fate, but commands it. So now, in these last few minutes, ask yourself with merciless honesty, have you built a mind that obeys not your feelings, but your commands? Have you trained your will to endure, not when things are pleasant, but when everything aches? Have you, even in small ways, begun to master the art of daily war, the war against passivity, against fear, against the slow decay of your own potential? If the answer is no, then the time to begin is now, not tomorrow, not after the next. Failure, not when you feel ready, because the only enemy discipline cannot defeat is delay. And the only habit you must break to begin is the one that whispers, later. And if the answer is yes, if even imperfectly you have begun this path, then continue without mercy, without pause, and without illusion, for the road of discipline is narrow, unglamorous, and often lonely, but it is the only road that leads not only to greatness, but to freedom. And that, above all, is what Machiavelli believed discipline to be, not a constraint, but the sole path to a life governed not by fear or chance, but by the clear, fierce sovereignty of a man who has chosen to rule himself.